Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of the 2025 Spring Hydrologic Outlook webinar series for the Greater Mississippi River Basin. I'm Rose Freeman, one of the hydrologists here at the National Water Center, and I will begin by providing a general overview of the Greater Mississippi River Basin. Following that, we'll hear from representatives for each of the 5 river forecast centers who will share more detailed information on the flood potential for their respective regions. This webinar is being recorded, and the follow-up email will be sent to all attendees. The email will include key message information, a link to the story map, a PDF copy of the content covered in this webinar, and a recording of this session. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box that's found on the bottom right of your screen, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. So getting started, the key message for today is that the spring flooding potential across most of the Ohio River Basin is slightly above normal, while the remainder of the Greater Mississippi River Basin continues to have a normal to below normal flood risk. Also, across the upper Midwest and northern plains, flooding potential due to snowmelt remains below normal due to a historic lack of snowpack. Now we'll go through some of the current conditions and forecast information and discuss how things have or haven't changed over these last 2 weeks and how that plays into the spring outlook. We'll begin by looking at the total amount of rainfall observed over the last 2 weeks. And really the main story here is the swath of about 4 to 8 inches of rainfall right here, right over Tennessee and a little bit of Tennessee and Kentucky, and down into the lower Mississippi Valley. Meanwhile, the remainder of the basin received very little to no rainfall. Now we'll look at the departure from normal precipitation for the past 2 weeks. And looking at all these light greens and the yellows on the map, we can see that the overwhelming majority of the basin has seen generally near normal precipitation amounts over the past 2 weeks, with really the only exception being portions of the lower Ohio Basin, specifically Kentucky and Tennessee, like I just mentioned, where you can see these about 2 to 6 inch positive departures from normal, the darker green shadings. And this is in response to that heavy rainfall event I just mentioned. Next is the current snow water equivalent, or I'll refer to it as SWE for the basin. And what we see here is that the SWE from 2 weeks ago, which is right here, and the current SWE values, which are shown here. Over the past 2 weeks, we've seen a noticeable reduction in SWE across much of the upper Mississippi Basin, with warmer temperatures and some rain on snow events likely contributing to that decline. So I'll do one more swipe so you can see that. However, portions of the upper Midwest still maintain higher SWE values, which you can see by this darker purple and the pink colors, which is mostly due to the frozen soils that are preventing infiltration. Overall, the snowpack remains below normal for this time of the year, reducing the flooding potential across much of the basin this spring. Now we'll look at how that combination of rainfall and snowmelt has impacted the current soil moisture conditions. And shown here is the Climate Prediction Center soil moisture ranking percentiles from 2 weeks ago. And then the current conditions that are seen here. And what really sticks out is the decrease in the warm colors across the northern and central plains, which is suggesting soils have experienced a slight improvement toward normal from 2 weeks ago. But as you can see, moisture deficits still remain. Also noteworthy is the significantly wetter than normal soils across the lower Ohio Valley, where we see soil moisture rankings above the 90th percentile, which are these greens here. And that makes sense given that rainfall event we've been talking about. Lastly, I just wanted to mention the Red River of the North, which continues to experience wetter than normal soils, although there's been a slight reduction in moisture compared to 2 weeks ago. Now moving on to the stream flows across the Mississippi Basin, we are looking at the U.S. Geological Survey's 14-day average stream flows. And what we are seeing is that stream flows across the Ohio and lower Mississippi basins remain elevated, but particularly across northern Tennessee and Kentucky into Virginia, which are these kind of the darker blues, which is consistent with the recent precipitation this area has seen. We are also starting to see some areas of elevated stream flows beginning to emerge across parts of the northern plains and upper Midwest, but especially here in the Red River of the North Basin, as snowmelt has started, like we saw in that previous SWE graphic. Meanwhile, stream flows across the remainder of the Mississippi Basin are mostly normal to below normal, with the bulk of the lower flows occurring in tributaries and less so the main stems across central portions of the basin, as indicated by all these oranges and reds here. Now taking a look at the longer-term drought conditions, the U.S. Drought Monitor indicates drought conditions remain in place across the upper portions of the Mississippi Basin, with severe to extreme drought still impacting the northern and central plains. And this really hasn't changed that much from what we saw 2 weeks ago. And now focusing on the forecast over the next few weeks and months, and starting with the 7-day precipitation forecast, rainfall is expected across much of the basin over the next week, with the highest totals of about 1.5 to 2 inches forecast over the Tennessee and lower Mississippi valleys. This rainfall shouldn't be significant enough to cause any widespread flooding issues, but it could produce some rises on smaller streams given the primed antecedent conditions already in place. Now looking at week 2, the Climate Prediction Center's 8 to 14-day precipitation outlook probabilities are leaning towards above normal precipitation across the Ohio Valley and below normal precipitation for the Red River of the North Basin, although the signal isn't very strong for either one of these. And for that same time period, the temperature outlook probabilities are leaning towards above normal temperatures for much of the basin, kind of excluding the Ohio Valley here that you see in the upper portions of the Missouri River Basin. Looking further down the road in March, April, and May, the CPC's seasonal precipitation outlook probabilities are leaning towards the above normal precipitation over the Ohio and Middle Mississippi basins. And also for that same time period, the seasonal temperature outlook probabilities are leaning towards below normal temperatures for the upper Missouri Basin and above normal temperatures for most of the southern US, with the signal strength increasing as you move towards the Gulf. Shifting gears now, I'll cover the 6-month forecast information for the Great Lakes from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which hasn't changed from the last outlook, but just to touch base again, Great Lakes ice cover has been below the historical average this season, which has allowed for increased evaporation over the lakes during the winter months. As a result, lake levels on Lake Superior, Lake Michigan-Huron, and Lake Ontario are forecast to remain below average throughout the spring and into the summer. On the other hand, Lake Erie and Lake St. Clair are expected to maintain above average lake levels through the spring, but will transition to below average levels as the summer months approach. Now, to show how all these conditions we have covered will impact the flood forecast across the greater Mississippi Basin this spring, we could take a look at the long-range flood outlook. And what we see here on this map is the 50% probability of reaching or exceeding minor, moderate, and major flood states. Based on this outlook, the southern half of the Mississippi Basin faces widespread minor flooding potential, with some areas also at risk for moderate flooding, particularly here in the lower Missouri Basin. It also shows that the potential for at least some minor flooding occurring on the Red River of the North has increased from the last outlook. And now I'll pass it to Jim at the Ohio Basin River Forecast Center for more details on that region.
Thank you, Rose, and good afternoon, everyone. If we move on to the next slide, we're going to zoom in on that 50% chance of flooding as we move into the rest of the late winter and spring season here in the Ohio River Basin. And what we're expecting is not a lot different than what we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Fairly widespread minor flooding is expected across the basin. It's very difficult because rainfall is the driving factor of where that'll exactly set up, but we are pretty confident that we're going to see renewed flooding. We had a well-advertised major flood event about a week and a half ago across portions of Tennessee, Kentucky, into West Virginia. And then the rivers are receding right now in the lower Ohio River system itself. And that is all pretty much what was expected. That lull looks to come to an end next week. and then will begin to turn wetter. So overall, we are expecting a minor flood risk widespread across the Ohio Basin, at least a 50% chance of that as we go through March and April especially. It could linger into a little bit of May, but really the focus for the Ohio Basin right now is March and April. That risk is considered slightly above normal for our basin. If we move on to the next slide, this is really looking at a better assessment of what usually happens just because we're looking so far out. We love to look at the 25% chance or what is possible. And this map is a better indicator showing, again, fairly widespread minor to moderate flooding. It looks like the best chances of the moderate flooding are going to be in the southern and western portions of the Ohio River Basin, including portions of southeast Illinois, southern half of Indiana down into Kentucky. We do have some drier soils, as Rose showed, over northern Ohio and northern Indiana, but because of the type of soils we have, that drier soil is further down into the column, and so it'll have minimal impact on runoff. So flooding is even possible there as we go through March and into April. So I guess the main message here is we have risk increasing again once we get starting next week, and then especially the middle of March to the end of March, it looks like. And so we just need everybody to stay aware that even though we just had a major flood, things are calming down right now in the Ohio Basin, but things are going to be revving back up as we go through March. And so I'm sure that when we talk in 2 weeks from now, we'll be talking about increased flood risks across the Ohio River Basin. And then if we go to the last slide for the Ohio Valley, this is really what's coming up with the first system next week. We do have a little bit of receding flooding in the western portion of Kentucky, in the Green River Basin and the actual lower Ohio River itself. Those are those colors there. But you also see some yellows and even some oranges showing up across portions of Ohio into Indiana and southeastern Illinois next week. And that is with the first system of a series of systems for March. So like Rose said, the 1 to up to 2 inches of rain possible next week probably won't do much more than bank full conditions to maybe a few minor floods across the Ohio Valley, but it will set the stage for significantly higher flows as we move into the middle and end of March. And with that, I'm going to go ahead now and turn it over to Jonathan for more information on the upper Mississippi Basin.
Thanks, Jim. This is Jonathan Thornburg from the North Central River Forecast Area. I'm going to cover the portion of the Mississippi River that goes from the headwaters of the Mississippi to just south of St. Louis. I'll also be covering the Red River Basin of the north and the Souris River, and some drainages into the Great Lakes like Lake Superior and Lake Michigan. Overall, the flood risk still remains below normal for everything north of Missouri and central Illinois. So not a lot has changed since the last outlook. We're still sitting in a pretty good position. The areas of Missouri and central Illinois and south of there are more of a near normal situation. To put this below normal flooding potential into perspective, the 50% exceedance probabilities only indicate minor flooding along the Red River main stem and a handful of other NWS river forecast points, mostly in the southern hydrologic service area and some of the other problem child forecast points that we have that are pretty typical to have some spring flooding. And then only one of our 460 National Weather Service forecast points in our area indicates a moderate chance of flooding, and we have no points that are showing any major whatsoever. Next slide, please. Focusing more on the main stem in terms of navigation and those along the main stem rivers, the Mississippi River and the Illinois River. Many of us are probably familiar with seeing these graphics, but I'll just do a quick recap on these. There's two ways that you can look at these graphics. You can look at the blue line and the black line, and you can say, okay, if the black line is to the right or below the blue line, then you have a lesser chance, we have drier than normal conditions and lesser chance of flooding. If the black line is above the blue line, you would have wetter than normal conditions and a higher chance of flooding. A more in-depth way to look at this is you could see those blue arrows there, and you can see on the blue line is the historical line showing that the Mississippi River at Rock Island, 50% of the time has a chance of hitting moderate flood levels, whereas we're currently with Rock Island for this outlook and the conditions that we currently have, we're only looking at a 14% chance of reaching moderate flooding. So big picture wise on the Mississippi River, we're sitting really in a good position. We're about 10 to 30% 10 to 30% below normal chance of exceeding moderate flood levels down the whole entire main stem for our portion of the main stem. And the Illinois River is around 15 to 20% below normal chance of exceeding moderate flood levels. Next slide, please. The one caveat that I have is about the frost depths, and we talked about this in the last outlook, and Rose talked about it some at the beginning of this outlook. Because we've had very little snowfall over the winter time, and we've had many temperature swings of very cold temperatures and then temperatures going above freezing across much of the area, we've lost a lot of our snowpack. But because the snowpack has not been there, it's been to insulate the ground, it's allowed frost depths to get very deep. So to put this in perspective, typically in Minnesota area, this time of year, we're looking at about 15 to 25 inches of depth, whereas right now, almost everywhere in the state has at least 27 inches. And you can see even up there in the Red River Valley, we have over 4 feet of frost. So deep frost, it can be a key ingredient in significant spring flooding due to its increased surface runoff risk when a rapid melt happens or a rain on snow or a heavy rainfall scenario. So rainfall scenarios, the temperature outlook, the CPC temperature outlook showed above normal temperatures. That could lead to a rain system somewhere where we could end up with a rain on top of frozen ground situation. So frost depths have increased slightly since the last outlook. We expected that to happen. They increased this 2 to 3 inches. However, we do think that the frost depths are probably at their peak at this point, and they're going to start trending downward as we hit this winter to spring transition. So on top of that, we've had some very favorable weather over the last few days. It's been really nice here in Minnesota. We've thawed some of that frost layer from pretty much the central Minnesota latitude south. We've lost a few inches on the top of the frost, which has allowed some room for infiltration. But again, there's the caveat there that northern Minnesota and like the Red River Valley, there has been very little to no frost at all. So it can be a little deceiving when you're looking outside and you see there's no snow anywhere, because we're carrying such a heavy frost that's essentially created a concrete surface. So it's just one of those things that we want to keep an eye on, even though the conditions right now are looking very favorable. So, and those flooding factors due to the frozen ground aren't necessarily captured by these hydrologic model exceedance probabilities. So another thing that we want to warn about is because of the lack of snow cover, there's been no insulation on the surface water bodies, such as your lakes and your rivers. So there's been a little bit more ice accumulation on the rivers this year. And that, as we come out of this winter to spring transition, will increase the risk for breakup ice jams. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to my neighbors over at NBRFC. Thank you.
Jonathan, this is Lisa Holtz, Senior Hydrologist here at the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center. And I would like to start off by saying that the flood risk for the Missouri River Basin is below normal for this spring. One of the reasons that for this lower than normal flood risk is that soil moisture conditions have deteriorated across the basin since last June. Early last year, we made a good run at extracting ourselves from what then was a 3-year-long drought that began in late 2020. The June 2024 U.S. Drought Monitor showed less than 10% of the basin being in drought. However, since June of last year, soil moisture conditions have continued to deteriorate to the point that currently the U.S. Drought Monitor classifies 64% of the Missouri River Basin in some level of drought. A significant reason for this return to drought conditions was temperatures. Calendar year 2024 was the second warmest year in 130 years of record for the Missouri River Basin. So for all intents and purposes, we across the basin are in our 5th year of drought. As this first graphic illustrates, minor to moderate level flooding is being outlooked for this spring, limited to the lower basin. Flooding in the lower basin is typical as thunderstorm activity drives lower basin flooding. In fact, we have already experienced some tributary flooding when 3 tributaries in the lower basin exceeded flood stage back on February 1st due to a couple of inches of rain on soils moistened by January snowmelt. We have also flooding ongoing in the plains of Montana. Unseasonably warm temperatures beginning late last week have resulted in melting of 1 to 2 inches of snow water equivalent from the lower elevation areas. The runoff from this melt, coupled with the presence of river ice, has caused rivers to run high in eastern Montana. Flooding is occurring or has occurred along Big Sandy Creek near Havre and along the Musselshell River near Mosby. Clear Creek near Chinook, the Tongue River near Miles City, and the Milk River near Harlem have all seen high stages as well. Many reports of low-lying aerial flooding has also been reported. As temperatures are expected to remain warm over the next few days, the risk for ice jam formation and breakup continues, which could lead to an additional flooding over the next week or so. This next graphic attempts to portray those river locations and reaches where flood risk is below normal. These areas are highlighted in blues. These are streams and locations where the chances for flooding this year is less than the historic chance of flooding. Areas not highlighted have a normal risk for flooding. This map alone cannot be used to determine whether we are outlooking flooding at any given location. That information was conveyed on that first graphic. Moving to my last set of graphics, mountain snowpack is critical for water resources within the Missouri River Basin. Looking at the mountains, this left-handed graphic, courtesy of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, shows by subbasin the snow water equivalent percent of 30-year average currently in the mountainous west. Mountain snowpack can generally be categorized as being near average for this time of year. By this point in the winter, we have normally accumulated approximately 80% of the seasonal peak snow water equivalent in the mountains, so things still could change. Looking at the graphic on the right, the NWS produces water supply forecasts similar to the NRCS. Our forecasts are in terms of April through September volumes projected. As is shown by the color of the dots on the right-hand map, we are expecting only about 50 to 75% of normal mountain runoff for most of the locations this year. I will briefly touch on the plains snowpack, which graphic Rose showed earlier in the presentation. Over the past week, we have lost most of the widespread but shallow plains snowpack that we did have over almost the entire Missouri River Basin. Plains snowpack thus far is not expected to play a role in enhancing spring flood risk within the Missouri Basin. And now a couple of closing remarks. With regard to soil temperatures and frost depth, the very cold January and absence of an insulating plains snowpack has resulted in significant frost depths being developed, especially across the Dakotas. If there was enough soil moisture in the ground when the cold temperatures locked in, that will exacerbate any spring runoff that does occur, as the ground would not be capable of absorbing any of the runoff. So that is still a wild card for these northern soils. Finally, a quick word regarding ice jam flood potential. As already mentioned, the risk for ice jam formation and breakup is elevated in Montana this week due to the rapid warm-up. Across the plains, while the risk for ice jam flooding remains low this season, there is ongoing ice movement across eastern Nebraska. It remains to say that wherever river ice is present, there is a risk for breakup flooding. To summarize, spring flood risk in the Missouri River Basin is overall below normal. During the next 3 months, minor to moderate flooding is expected in the lower basin. Thank you. That concludes the Missouri River Basin Flood Potential Brief. I will now pass it on to Becky at the Arkansas Red Basin River Forecast Center.
Thank you, Lisa. The outlook for spring river flooding for ABRFC is lower than it was 2 weeks ago, but our risk of flooding is still near normal because our climatological risk of river flooding is driven by convective rain events. This spring, we're expecting a 50% greater chance of seeing some flooding on the Poto River and the Neosho River basins in Oklahoma, and the Petit Jean and Fouche-la-Fave Rivers basins in Arkansas. The core reservoirs in both the Red River and the Arkansas River Basin systems both have about 99% of their total flood control storage capacity available, so these reservoirs are in great condition to hold back any potential runoff. Now I'll turn it over to Matt Wilson with the Lower Mississippi RFC to talk about their area.
Thanks, Becky. This is Matt Wilson from the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center here in Slidell, Louisiana. Here in the Lower Mississippi Basin, flooding on the main stem is primarily driven by inputs from the upstream basins. We are expecting those inputs to be average to below average at this time. Flooding in the rest of the basin is due primarily to heavy rainfall. We currently expect the overall flood risk to be average to below average. At the time of the first outlook, there was a large rain event forecasted that influenced many of our flood chances higher. With that event in the rearview mirror, the majority of locations have lowered their chances for flooding in this outlook. The main exceptions to this are our locations on the lower Ohio River. Next slide. Currently, we have over 50 locations above the action stage, but almost all of them are past crest and receding. With that said, we do have a few basins of concern for flooding this spring. First, the Mississippi Delta region, the Pearl and Gulf Coast basins east of the Mississippi River, and large swaths of this area have received above average rainfall since the beginning of the winter season. Second, the White and Black basins in Arkansas, they have also received above average precipitation this winter. Third, the Calcasieu drainage in southwest Louisiana and the drainages on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain in eastern Louisiana. Lastly, the section of the Mississippi River immediately below Cairo, Illinois, and the confluence with the Ohio River. As always, flooding is a common occurrence in our service area, and that trend will continue this year. Now back to Rose in Tuscaloosa.
Thanks, Matt. We'll wrap up this presentation with one more look at our key messages for this year's spring flood outlook. The potential for spring flooding across most of the Ohio River Basin is slightly above normal, while the remainder of the greater Mississippi River Basin has a normal to below normal flood risk. Additionally, flood risk due to snowmelt across the upper portions of the basin is below normal. If you have any questions for today's presenters and you haven't already utilized that question box, feel free to do so now, and we'll take a few minutes to answer them. Okay, no questions are seen. Thank you for tuning in, everyone. And just a reminder that a follow-up email will be sent with the key messages, a link to the story map, a PDF copy of the information we just covered, and the recording of this webinar. Please reach out to your River Forecast Center or us here at the National Water Center if you have any questions or need any other information. Thanks again, and have a great weekend.